Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Nicholas Serota, Director of the Tate, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here this evening for one in what is a series of debates taking place here at Tate on that will address the issues, political, economic, social and cultural dimensions of globalization at the start, no longer really the start, of the 21st century. I think Tate is a very appropriate place for these debates to be taking place. Sometimes thought that art should be removed from society, that a museum of this kind should be in some way a refuge from what is happening in the wider world. But as I think we all know, artists are determined, or many artists are determined, that their work should address some of the issues in that wider world and some of the issues that press most urgently upon us at the beginning of the 21st century. So we make no apology, indeed are rather proud, that this series of debates should be taking place here at Tate Modern. They have been organized, as you are aware, I think, by Zamin, and I would like to thank Michael Arminian for conceiving the series, for working with us in presenting it. And Michael, you are a force to be reckoned with, and I think the quality of the those engaged in the debates over the past week or so and in the next 3 weeks is very much a product of your energy. Here at Tate, I want to thank Marco, Daniel, and Chris Dercon, who I'll introduce in a moment, for being involved in the presentations and in the series. And I also want to thank the partners for the whole project. Those partners are Accenture, Africa Progress Panel, Barclays, the School of African and Oriental Studies here in London, and of course Zamin. And those partners are genuinely partners, not simply financial contributors. Tonight, Chris Dercon, Director of Tate Modern, will act as moderator. Chris, formerly director of Wit de Wit in Rotterdam, then the Boijmans van Beuningen Museum, also in Rotterdam, and most recently, before he became director of Tate Modern, he was director of the Haus der Kunst in Munich from 2003 until 2010. The debate tonight is about the role of museums, not just as collecting institutions, but as institutions that display works, bring together artists and a public, and debate the place of art in society, and debate interpretations of history. What this panel will do, I think, will be to question the way in which museums have played this role in the past, how their role is changing, and what it might be in the future. And with that, I will hand over to Chris Dercon. Chris, thank you for moderating this evening. We look forward very much to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Marco. And thank you, Michael. What an agenda we have tonight. And we only have 2 hours. My goodness. Ladies and gentlemen, I conceived, after coming back from Venice, where we had similar discussions, and Germany, where people are discussing the same kind of subject, I wrote this morning in the plane a little statement. And I would like to confront you with that statement. Ladies and gentlemen, it is true that we live in an epoch when the old hegemony, the Western world, by which, of course, I mean especially Europe and America, is, if not declining, at least in crisis. It is in crisis from, of course, an economical point of view, if only because new economical powers are emerging, most of which are challenging quite seriously Western domination. But its hegemony is even more in crisis in the field of cultural production. The epicenter of global transformations is now located very firmly in the global south and in the east. And it seems to me that these transformations call for completely new forms of engagement. Engagement with foreign worlds and foreign cultures. They also call for rethinking of cultural institutions that have to recalibrate their traditional roles in order to take into account the creative forces that are emerging in the global south in particular. And what is striking is the high velocity of circulation of creative forces and forms, and the huge desire from local actors to be connected to larger entities and ensembles. And in that sense, we will have to invent new forms of intervention, all of which aim not only conciliating what already exists, but helping cultural thinkers and cultural creators to enter into cross-disciplinary conversations, such as the one we had yesterday and the day before yesterday, and the one we had and we have tonight. Cross-disciplinary conversations which are involving politics, economics, and of course, culture. Because without taking into account culture, I don't think we can reinvent economics, and we definitely cannot reinvent a new form of politics. Tonight, we will debate with Professor Hung next to me and Elvira Dyangani Ose and Olav Velthuis. We will discuss these and other matters. We and the organizers put to these three speakers 3 provocations, and I will come to you later with these 3 provocations. They worked on it for a very long time. Elvira Dyangani Ose. Elvira Dyangani Ose is working with us at Tate Modern since 2011, and she is curator international art, and we were able to work with her thanks to the support of the Guarantee Trust Bank in Lagos, Nigeria. Guarantee Trust Bank, which of course has also very important economical relationships with the rest of the world. And while she was born and has her roots in Equatorial Guinea, she studied art history and the history of architecture in Catalonia, in Barcelona. And since then, she's doing many, many different things. She's, amongst others, completing at Cornell University, she's completing her Master of Art in History of Art and Visual Studies, and specializing in African culture, African arts, with somebody you might know well, Salah Hassan. She also has been working in the Gran Canaria, in Las Palmas, and she has been working in Cameroon, in Douala, and she has also been working quite recently, and she's continued to work in Congo, in Lubumbashi. And Elvira, she is going to publish very soon an essay which is inspired by the famous sociologist Achille Mbembe, who is teaching in Witwatersrand in South Africa, and he wrote this fantastic book, Sortir de la Grande Nuit. Let's get out from the big night. And he introduced, together with the famous Nigerian writer, the word Afropolitanism. And she is now writing and publishing an essay which is called, Are You an Afropolitan? And in that essay, Elvira Dyangani Ose suggests it's time to get rid of the qualification of African. Okay? If we have to get rid of the qualification of African, or Chinese for that matter, or the Middle Eastern, so how are we going to call these things? And how are we going to call these things which we call new forms of engagement and intervention? And of course, Hung, who is the Henry van der Stappen professor in Chicago since quite a while, he's very interested in that, because he thinks that we got it completely wrong in the way we, in the West, look at this thing called Chinese modern, Chinese contemporary art. And he has been writing about this. He has been writing about this always like playing ping pong with the old and the new. He's very interested in the relationships between older visual forms and traditions and older forms of ritual, social memory, and even political discourses. And he looks at the new through the eyes of the old, and he looks through the eyes of the old at the new. And his book, which he published years ago, Transience, Chinese Experimental Art at the End of the 20th Century, published by the University of Chicago Press, is for many of us interested in Chinese modern and contemporary art a true Bible. But last year he published The History of Ruins, which is a story, which is an analysis of the concept of absence in Chinese traditional and even contemporary culture. And now he's working for Thames and Hudson at a book called Chinese Contemporary Art, A History. Hung, I'm really curious how you're going to combine the old and the new today in this debate, because of course you have competition. Think of somebody you might know, Robert Lederhosen at the University of Heidelberg, who keeps telling us, stop it the way you look at Chinese contemporary art, try to understand first the old and then talk about the new. We'll see what you do with this. Then Olav Velthuis. I'm not going to speak tonight Dutch with Olav Velthuis. I'm not from Holland. He is from Holland, but we speak the same language. He is now associate professor at the Department of Sociology and Anthropology of the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam. See, that's Dutch. The Free University of Amsterdam. Oh, the University of Amsterdam. So he understands Dutch. It was just a test. And he's there at the department. He's the director of the master programs. But before, and I was an avid reader of his pieces, of his essays, before he was the staff reporter of globalization for the Dutch newspaper, the Volkskrant, the People's Daily. His books, and he published, amongst others, in this red book about the globalization of the art market, which was published by Sternberg Press in Berlin, thanks to an initiative in Stockholm through Tensta Konsthal. And in that book, which he co-edited with Maria Lind, he's speaking about contemporary art and its commercial markets, a report on current conditions and future scenarios. And also he's publishing about patterns of globalization within the contemporary art market. I'm mentioning these two titles. He has many more provocative titles, but every time he's publishing in the Volkskrant, Corriere della Sera, or Le Monde, people in the art world, they get a little bit anxious, they get upset, because I think he starts to understand how it all works. He's making, of course, a difference between the cultural and the economical powers, and one of his strongest statements lately has been, don't worry so much about the economical powers. They are there, they are big, they are powerful, but cultural power might be just as important and maybe even more important. To these three speakers, we put the following provocations. Now listen carefully. The appropriation, number one, the appropriation and ownership of art mirrors the world of commerce. True, not true? Provocation number two, the display of art, of artifacts and works of art, fetishes them and perpetuates archaic definitions and perceptions of other cultures. Perpetuates archaic definitions and perceptions of other culture. True, not true? And the third and last provocation, art can provide a mode of engaging with the conditions of globalized culture that gives voice to individuals and makes material their concerns. Hung, now it's up to you to react on these three provocations, and I believe you have some images.
I have 3 images. I have also 3 to 5 minutes.
But not more.
No more. So it's very exciting to be here to join this panel discussion, or we say a debate. I will respond to these questions with a few remarks. I won't answer these questions because these are very big issues. I anticipate a very interesting discussion. So I wrote down some remarks. I want to read it. I will start from the topic of this panel, artifacts. Artifact is a word favored by archaeologists. Art historians and art museums, like me, prefer the more lofty word, the work of art. By calling an artifact a work of art, we give it a special status, as well distinct aesthetic and commercial values. How these values have been established is a long story, but we should keep in mind that the concept of art or fine art is always historically and culturally defined. In China, for example, the idea of fine art was restricted to portable painting and calligraphy before the 20th century. No sculptors, printmakers, or architects were ranked artists before 20th century. Their works didn't exist in so-called art collections of emperors and scholars. This situation changed fundamentally in the 20th century when the country embraced the European art system. As a result, art museums, not only in London, Paris, but also in Shanghai and Beijing, started to reinvent independent art histories of Chinese sculpture and architecture. Such a historical reinvention of artifacts was not just realized in museums, in art academies, but was also realized in the field and the marketplace through destruction and through shady transactions. Buddhist statues, for example, were removed from cave chapels to become transportable works of art as well as commodities. Sometimes an entire building was relocated to a Western museum. But if this process of decontextualization and redefinition started as a colonial or imperial practice, it soon became a basic technology of the new nation state in rewriting its art history. For example, no Chinese art collections in China before the 20th century included this kind of work, beautiful clay statue, figurine, because everybody knew it was created for the dead and belonged to the tomb. So nobody collected before the early 20th century. Such works called spirit articles first appeared in the marketplace, in antique market in the early 20th century, when China entered modern era. So it's very interesting. There is a coincident timing, became commodity, entered the market, became museum objects, and in the early modern era. But now they have become indispensable to any museum display in China and in the West. So should we cast this modern art historical system away and re-embrace the pre-modern concept of art and artifacts? I don't think it can be done so easily. The dilemma is how to integrate indigenous aesthetic standards and art historical discourses into a modern system that is essentially homogeneous and alien. For art historian museum, it's a very difficult challenge, how to integrate. To explore the complexity of this situation, it is interesting, I put a comparison here. It's interesting to juxtapose here, a beautiful statue of Bodhisattva in an art museum with this installation by Ai Weiwei, contemporary artist Ai Weiwei, which displays, as you can see, 10 pairs of stone feet broken off from Buddha statues. You can have this. Mm-hmm. So this feet, broken feet, considered worthless for their damaged condition. But this pair of images raises a more challenging question for me. While Ai Weiwei's work delivers a sharp critique of the antique market and the system of art collecting which supports it, this work nevertheless transforms ancient artifacts, in this case broken ones, into art by means of what we call the ready-made. Thank you.
Thank you. Elvira.
Well, it's really exciting and challenging for me to be here, since I'm part of this house. This is my home. But I said to myself that in order to respond to these provocations, I will use two of them to frame my ideas. And I promise to respond to your question, which is a fourth provocation later on in the debate, because I think it's interesting to talk about why we should get rid of the African artists in a specific context. But in order, as I said, to talk about artifacts and the subject of this panel, I decided to go to two examples. And the first one is, I guess I had to press, there you go. The first one is The Status Also Died, film that was made, a short documentary that was made by Chris Marker and Alain Resnais in 1953 and commissioned by Alain Diop, a Senegalese intellectual who in 1941 was starting to conceive this magazine that will reflect on ideas of a revised, let's say, African socialism, and that will try to convey the new ideas beyond the subject of the male or of the female black men and women. What they wanted to do at the time was to reflect on ideas that Nkrumah, George Patmore, Kenyatta, William Du Bois were conceiving through one of the Pan-African Congress that happened here in 1945 in Manchester. And the idea was to reflect on how we can conceive a new African personality, if we want to use Nkrumah's term. So Alain Diop asked this question to Chris Marker and Alain Resnais. Why African art is displayed in the Musée de l'Homme in Paris, while Egyptian and Greek art is displayed at the Louvre? And that was what triggered the film. That was triggers the movie. And as you know, in 1941, they couldn't do the magazine. They waited until the Second World War came in the way, and they decided to move ahead in 1947. With this, Presence Africaine, we became one of the most challenging magazines, as I say, sort of trying to collect all those and combine those ideas. And what they did with the status aussi is to explore how the meaning of African statues, the traditional African art, was changing when displayed in the museum. And the movie starts with this sentence that we can also ask ourselves in the context of these panels. They say, when men die, they enter into history. When a status dies, they enter into art. And the botany of death is what we call culture. And I think it's an incredible and a provocative way of addressing the subject. And I wanted to bring a couple of images and a little bit of a movie, but I'm going to try to summarize very briefly what I think the camera does to present us with these ideas. So the camera guides us through the shadows by a thoughtful narrator commentary, using the words that I just pronounced, take us inside the museum. It pauses for a few seconds to each shot and stares successively at objects which leap to the screen at each shot as he's trying to engage us in a dialogue that could otherwise not take place. The images make us accomplices to the death of these works, which become mute as soon as they appear, since nobody is prepared to listen then and to confront their truth. The film denounces their forcible insertion into a commercial circuit that you and Chris were talking about, in which a relationship with the artwork is based chiefly on the detached observation, which is far removed from the role played by this object within the environment and the context of social and cultural practices in which they are made. And my provocative question is to think about how objects of that kind nowadays, but also, as they were putting in the provocation, the archive definitions and perception of other culture production are still prevail, and still a movie like that one is still valuable today. And this is a provocation that I send to you guys in order to reflect on the ideas presented to the panel. The second example that I want to use, and I hope I still have my minute and a half, is the Angola National Pavilion participation at the Venice Biennale, which is this one. For those of you that can attend to the preview, maybe you already have collected maybe 10 or 5 or 6 of these 23 offset posters that were displayed in this room, these large pieces of found objects that the artist Exxon Chagas found around Luanda. And what is interesting about the pavilion is that it's a way of reflecting in the public space and in the changes in the future that is occurring nowadays in Luanda. But it's also, for me, a reflection in how important is the way in which artists intervene in the public space. Because as some of you know, some of the objects were found in the place where the photography was taken, but some others were removed from the original setting to sometimes 2 meters away, but also sometimes 2 kilometers away to stage a specific meaning. So there is also the action taken by the artist that made that record or the record of this event and this particular work very, very interesting. The Angola's national participation was entitled Luanda Encyclopedic City, in parallel to Massimiliano Gioni's ideas on the encyclopedic, his exhibition on the encyclopedic world. And it was curated by Beyond Entropy, which is a curatorial duet formed by Paola Nascimento and Stefano Ravioli that are looking at also the way in which the public space was also challenging in the case of their participation in the Biennale de Venezia in architecture. So for me, also, I wanted to use that as to respond to the second provocation, that was how art can provide a mode of engaging with conditions of globalized culture. And Luanda is very much one of these spaces, one of these cities in the global south, that is connecting ideas on consumerism, that is connecting artists that are challenging the public space, and that stress a lot of potential and the strong activist potential of this kind of projects in order to interrogate the public space, but also the role of art as an agent for social transformation. And I want also to use that to talk about, in the debate, about the dislocation of certain words, the location, sort of like joining together these two proposals, the location within the displays as a dislocation of those work. And I think I'm going to stop there.
You should.
Thank you. Thank you.
Olav, bravo.
I will mostly respond to the first provocation, that the appropriation and ownership of art mirrors the world of commerce, which is a bit of an ambiguous provocation. But if you think of it as, well, we live in an era of profound economic globalization, so that will lead to, or that will somehow produce or coincide with profound cultural globalization, at least for visual arts, for high arts, then my answer to that provocation is very simple. It's no, not at all. I think it is very easily overstated how profound, how deep cultural globalization is. I'm studying at the moment art worlds in 4 of the biggest emerging economies: China, Brazil, Russia, and India, together with a small research team. And one of the things that we're doing is basically counting in Europe and the United States, but also in those countries, what people are really looking at, what they are collecting, what museums are exhibiting, what galleries are showing. And what we find is that all these worlds, and then I'm not talking just about those BRIC countries, but also about Europe and the United States, are extremely local. If you walk into a random gallery in New York or in London or in Amsterdam, what you will mostly find are local artists. If you walk into a random museum, if it is not the Tate, but if you walk into a random museum, you will mostly find European artists in Europe, American as well, but very little from other regions. There is a lot of discourse about cultural globalization, but if you look at their actual collection policies, it's only a couple of percent it's on the rise, that's right, but it's still only a couple of percent. Now, it's not very different in the BRIC countries, in Brazil, Russia, India, and China. I was just a couple of weeks ago, I was in Delhi visiting one of my PhD students who is there for a year studying the world in depth. And I was talking to some art collectors, and I was quite amazed, I mean, not positively or negatively, but just amazed how shallow their knowledge and information is about what is going on in contemporary art worlds in Europe and the United States. To some art collectors, when I was mentioning the name of Damien Hirst, they would really have to think hard. Well, yeah, I think I've heard that name once. And that is as far as it goes. In New Delhi, what people are collecting is almost exclusively Indian art. Indian art that gets consecrated, very good Indian art, but it's Indian art. There's very little collecting of European art, American art. Now, you might say, well, maybe this is just the beginning of an era, and with globalization, people traveling around, things being shown abroad, that will happen. I mean, it's just a matter of time. I have serious doubts about that. I don't think we should think of cultural globalization as a linear process, as something that is starting off, that is being propelled maybe by economic globalization, and that will lead to a further integration of a global art world. I don't think that is going to happen. And I think actually the discourse that you find right now in the art world, it reminds me very much of the discourse in the 1970s, when I wasn't around. Well, I was around, but I wasn't participating in the discourse, but at least what I read in books from the 70s and 80s about globalization of the cultural industry. So, for instance, Hollywood. We were thinking that there would be this tremendous Americanization of the cultural industries, that everybody would be looking at Hollywood movies and would be looking at the soap operas being produced in the United States. And look at what has happened. A little bit of that, but at the same time, what you see is all kinds of regional centers around the world that are as productive when it comes to the output of movies, for instance, in, say, Bollywood or in Nigeria. Is that the word? How do you call the Nigerian film industry? Is it Nollywood? Is it Nollywood? Yeah, that's how you call it. So what you find is a strong regionalization, and I think that is also what we're heading for in the art world. And one reason, and that's what I probably should already be stopping with, one reason for that, no, I'll mention two reasons for that. One simply has to do with taste. If taking the cultural industries again as an example, the cultural repertoires that you find in different countries are not compatible to one source of production that is being spread all over the world. There are local repertoires, taste repertoires that people have and that make them prone to understand, make sense, like certain types of cultural products and others not. So there is a taste component to it, but apart from that, there is also an organizational reason. I think actually the Tate here is one of the few institutions in the world that has the organizational capabilities. That means people all over the world, networks, traveling almost continuously all over the world to have a good grasp of what is going on in those different regions. And very few institutions have that type of organizational power. I mean, it's not easy to have a good grasp of what is going on in, I don't know, you name it, Sao Paulo or in Buenos Aires at the moment. You have to have a very deep presence there. You have to be there for a long time. And organizationally, that is just not what is possible for a lot of cultural institutions in the present world. Now, what that leads to, and that is what I'm stopping with, what that leads to is, you know, these... it's a form of globalization that is taking place right now where curators are traveling around the world, but what they're basically doing is just working off those lists, kind of preconceived lists of artists that are considered to be hot at the moment, and they will pay a quick visit to their studio, and they might be included in shows that are about something new, Indian this, or contemporary Brazilian that. And that is what I hear artists in these countries complaining a lot about, that they are, in the end, selected frequently not just for their artistic merit, but more for their nationality. And I think that is what is irritating in those worlds. Just to round off, so cultural globalization, yes, it does exist, but I think it is overstated. There are very strict limits to how far in the visual arts globalization can go. I think what we're heading for is more like in the cultural industries, regional centers that are to some extent connected through a smaller group of artists that really have a global presence, that are being shown and talked about and understood and made sense of in a more global sphere, but mostly, predominantly, it will remain organized in a local way.
Thank you, Olav. Olav, are you still a journalist?
If I say yes, are you then not going to tell me interesting things? Or no, I'm not a journalist.
I'm just going to bring you the news about globalization. I mean, you heard this morning, you read probably in all the newspapers that the Americans and the Europeans, they want to break open NAFTA, and that also culture is up for grabs. And Karel de Gucht, the European Commissioner who is responsible and who is presiding the negotiations, he doesn't consider culture anymore a taboo. And it's David Cameron, ladies and gentlemen, who is really at the forefront of breaking it all open. So, I mean, you're talking about the fact that globalization is, in terms of cultural networks, is not happening, is not going to take place. But now we see that Hollywood is already like celebrating tonight because they know that they can defy la culture ou bien the exceptional idea of culture, the French who try to protect French products. And many filmmakers this morning, they signed together a piece of paper saying, we don't want this to happen. We are afraid because if we break open NAFTA, then it's over. So you as a journalist, how do you react to that?
Well, yeah, it's very simple. A lot of countries don't have those protective measures that France has at the moment, and still you find that local culture remains very strong there. By the way, the dynamic of the high arts, of the visual arts, is a very different one than the dynamic of the cultural industries, of the movie industries. So my main...
How do you see the difference?
Well, I mean, I think partially, for me, I think what puts a brake on globalization, so I'm not saying it is not happening. What I'm saying is it is happening in a very small group, in a group of artists that you see at the biennials, for instance. But we don't have a clue here in Europe about what is going on, for instance, in China, in like a market that is very strong there of these, what we would consider sentimental kitsch artists who in the market are doing extremely well, but we just don't know what is going on there, and we don't have an interest in it either.
Uhong, do you agree with Olav, who tries to make a difference between, let's say, the cultural industries, and cultural industries is music, it's cinema, it's audiovisual products, and this thing which we call artifacts of works of art? Should we make a difference?
Yes, I think we are making difference when we use these words. But I want to come back a little bit about your discussion, because these global, local things have been controlling our discourse discussion for quite a few years. But I feel just your discussion also seems these polar concepts themselves probably need to be re-examined. For example, when we talk about global, we mean kind of networking. When we talk local, is some kind of place within, but it's already within this network. I just want to use Hong Kong as an example. It's very hard to define. Hong Kong now, probably you know, is emerging as a major center of contemporary art, especially commercially. All these commercial artists, high power, moved there from London, from New York, from other parts of the world. The art fair becoming the most powerful one. But Hong Kong, by definition, is a Chinese city, but it has a colonial past. People educated speak Chinese and English, often studied Oxford or Cambridge. So it's an interesting example. Can we use the local, global, these polar concept to describe this kind of place?
Do you agree this whole idea of taste as a regional product or as a regional expression?
Exactly.
Do you agree
the
with
taste,
that?
What is Hong Kong taste? What is Hong Kong artifacts? And what is global there? So that's also, I join your question.
We were talking before about François Julien, who is a very famous French sinologist. He wrote this book in praise of blandness. And he, blandness. And he considers, for instance, the work of Ai Weiwei as bland. But bland, in the words of François Julien, is a quality. Now, the interesting thing is that we don't have yet, I think, a system to measure these kind of expressions which are belonging to a very kind of local, I would say, environment, like a local context. So is there a future for global art, Elvira?
I do think there is a future for global art. I don't know if we will qualify it as global. And I wanted to add another reason that maybe also helped to connect this local and global and what you were saying, because one of the most important things to remember here is that colonization was a kind of globalization as well. So in the case of African countries, African societies, and I'm talking, for the sake of the conversation and the argument in general terms, but we should make distinctions between countries because, of course, Africa is a huge continent, and within the continent there are countries that had within them societies that operate in different ways. But I wanted to say that colonization also brought to most of these communities an understanding of the world before they could even define or put on stage their own culture. So when you have Nollywood or you have other ways in which the local is integrated into that long conversation, we are talking about an understanding and a production of culture, a production of knowledge that is very much localized. But within these, as the Afropolitanism terms states, within a regional, as you were saying, conversation. So the people is focusing in Nigeria or in Lagos in expressing things or in rethinking history in their own terms because they need that history to be said, to be written. It doesn't exist in the context of the colonial, and it sees through the independence as a way of a conversation that has overlooked certain aspects of the history. So there is a need of producing knowledge culturally, locally. That is one thing. And just I wanted to add the second thing.
Right.
Sorry. The second thing is to respond to your comment before on the African. And we should get rid of the African art at the qualification as African. Only if African means, as you were saying before, to localize the artists in a confined framework, conceptual framework. They cannot move from a set of motifs. They cannot move from a certain ideas or topics. And what I said is that these artists are working and talking to the rest of the world. They shouldn't be defined only by the cultural background. In that sense, cultural identity and cultural background works as a confined territory, which the artist seems that cannot be moved from them. No? So I think when you talk about, these curators, certain curators, not certainly Tate curators, that goes around the world, just looking at a given list to invite these artists to participate, there are curators that are looking at geography as an aesthetic value. Exactly. And this is the thing that we should avoid. That's why I'm saying, African, if that is the use of Africanness that you are claiming for, it should get rid of. And you should talk about an art that is international and per se global.
I think what Elvira is saying is extremely important for our debate, because I have the impression that if we would have done this debate with you in '58 when Chris Marker and Alain René produced for French state television, Les Statuts meurent aussi, it would have been a completely other debate. Because in the 50s and the 60s, we have seen all these world cultural festivals, Jeddah, Shiraz. We went with famous Dutch filmmakers to China to celebrate what was going on there. Now, after 68, 69, and especially with the OPEC, with the oil crisis, we have a completely different situation. Not only tensions between the West and the East, not only in terms of what's happening and going on with the Cultural Revolution, but also locally, we have many, many corrupt regimes which are stepping up. So the whole idea of global, 40s, 50s, 60s, and our optimism of Chris Marker and Alain René suddenly get interrupted, and there is a stasis of about 30 years, and now we're starting again. Did we miss something out? I mean, would it be interesting for you, for instance, to go back and say, okay, let's think what's going on in the 50s and the 60s?
Very interesting historical perspective. Actually, I think it's when we think back, 1920s, 30s, even part of 40s represent the global moments. Actually, then like Tokyo, like Shanghai were global cities. But World War II somehow created a very deep gap.
That was
separation,
the first gap.
And then reinforced by Cold War. So somehow we started all over again from ground zero. Somehow, you know, the Shanghai was Paris in the East. If you study visual culture, study ballroom, you study music, jazz, somehow restarted in 1980s, 90s, somehow East-West suddenly put it apart. I feel your question is very interesting. You see, this local, global is not only currently the shifting, negotiating, but historically sometimes get together. Silk Road in the past, from ancient Rome all the way to China, Xi'an, Tang Dynasty, we're connected. But then some point we're put apart. Then I think now probably we try to close the gap. But again, starting from very different points, because separation, you cannot naturally get back together. There are different rhetoric, ideology, politics, and the new situation. So I feel your question very interesting. We now have a different layer. It's not just a global local, also different histories, different memories. Like Africa, this local memory, how this memory can become global. Actually, it's filtering through.
That might be, local memory might be a very viable alternative for your local tasting.
Yeah, like these are local memories somehow in Venice.
Olaf, why don't we use local memory instead of taste?
What is wrong with local taste? What irritates you about that?
It irritates me. It irritates me because, you know, I'm irritated since a couple of years by our tastemaker Bourdieu. I mean, I think the whole idea of taste is, for me especially, in these very complex new societies. I think taste is something which is not a given. I mean, it's a complete construct which changes constantly. So the whole concept of taste, I have a problem with, and I think we should speak about local memories. Because, Elvira, what can we learn from the 50s and the 60s of the Le Congrès Africain in Alger, the optimism around Senghor, and all these cultural festivals?
Well, I mean, sorry.
Yes, of course.
I mean, all these cultural, it's a very small fraction. I mean, I don't. So for me, it is partially I want to understand like how deep do these processes go, and if I mean honestly what we do in our project is partially just counting. We go to collectors and count in their house what they have there and where it is coming from. And we do the same with museums, with galleries, and we find that it is very, very little is cross-border art that is coming from, not from the country where that institution is or where that collector is. And I find it important because it is a different picture if you just look at what is being collected, what's being exhibited, even in biennials. I mean, look at the Venice Biennial now. in the end, the number of artists coming from outside of Europe and the United States, it remains a small fragment. And so I think there is a disconnect between the discourse about globalization and then it is all the time about those events that do happen and, yeah, of course, where a great dialogue exists between different regions, but it is a minority of what is going on in the art world.
But our provocation, Elvira and Hung, and my provocation is that it used to be completely different, even in the 50s, 60s. We can give you examples of China, we can give you examples of India, think of the Ahmedabad factor, we can give you examples of Africa. So, Elvira, what happened in Africa in the 50s, 60s? What should we learn from the 50s, 60s from Africa to do, to make this discourse which we use today, which is finally an economical discourse, to improve it, to correct it, to remediate it, so to speak?
I mean, I think the question here will be, first of all, ask when they start to collect, because I think that is important as well. And also, in the case of African countries or African festival and Biennale, I think I will agree with you. Like, for me, we're more interested in what was happening in the 60s and in 70s in Lagos, Algiers, and Dakar than what is happening in the Biennale of Dakar nowadays, or maybe even in the Biennale of Lubumbashi. We're reaching to, for obvious reasons in terms of like shipping the word to those cities, etc., the understanding of the connection with like a global art scene could be limited. But I think what is important, and that's what I get the title or the term of local memory, is that was already in the way in which people in Dakar, Lagos, and Algiers wanted to embrace the world, looking at that international and more inclusive narrative. So the problem now is like, what happened with that? And I think examples like the Biennale of Dakar, which also, as I say, when you work from the 80s and 90s and also in 2000, what you want is to create events that are, of course, international, but that help to showcase local culture. And local, I mean, in this case, regional, because this is what happened in Dakar, or what happened in Lubumbashi, or what happened in Bamako, or what happened in Ethiopia. There is a need of platform that will give opportunity to local artists. So it's about the production of local knowledge that will then engage with other networks. And in the case of African artists today, it's also, they are participating in a conversation. It's very much in the global south. So again, we are making this connection with a local memory that tries to embrace the international, but this time escaping, let's say, the West.
A question for Hung and for Olav. Shouldn't we stop being cynical about these Chinese auction houses and Chinese collectors who only buy Chinese art and try to reinvent even a tradition of collecting Chinese ink paintings? Because when I read reports in the art world, but also beyond the art world, it's complete cynical. These Chinese, they have too much money. They don't understand what's going on. Would that be a first step, a G8 step to stop being cynical?
Probably that's a journalist.
He's not a, we found he's not a journalist anymore.
No, not you, but the voice, the attitude, being...
You first. I mean...
I feel as a curator, I cannot afford to be cynical. Otherwise, I just become journalist. So being a curator, you have to be positive. You see, of course, there are a lot of garbage, a lot of commercial, a lot of bad thing, a lot of these things floating on the surface. Just a beautiful lake, always something of dirty things.
But as a curator,
curator, you see reflection, you see what's on the bottom. And I feel that a lot of things very interesting, like that piece, Ai Weiwei's piece, is not well known. Actually, I don't think it ever been published. I see it's about absence. It's not a beautiful statue, it's absence. It's something we talked about, this very difficult Chinese term called dan, meaning insipid. Insipidness. How can be insipidness? Can be beautiful. It's boring, right? How can boring become bland, become beautiful? I feel still modern people still try to remember it. Some artists, not all artists.
So a curator cannot afford to be cynical, but you can suffer as a curator.
I can suffer. I can
When you look at the prices of the Chinese auction house, you must suffer.
We have to, I'm sure you suffer a lot. I suffer a lot. And especially you do video art. I feel, oh my God, I had to watch hours in terms to find 5 minutes. That's we had to go through it. The art is there.
Olaf, should we stop being cynical about these local markets? About the Chinese paying too much money for art or the Indians paying too much money for art? Should we stop being cynical?
Yeah, no, I think, well, I'm not cynical about it at all, so I will continue being positive or optimistic about it, and for a couple of reasons. One thing is that you, with these collectors, a fraction of them, after having collected that type of stuff and bought amazing prices, and we're talking really about multi-million dollar prices for those types of paintings, they sometimes get into collecting something more seriously, which requires a more a different type of knowledge of contemporary art. So that's one reason not to be cynical about it. Another one is what I particularly actually like about China and the way art is being marketed there is that it also has a refreshing directness about it. I mean, here in Europe and the United States, of course, still the model is, even in the art market, even in the galleries, is that you shouldn't talk about money. I mean, it's all about commerce, but don't mention it. And there, it's the exact opposite. It's about commerce, so let's be as in your face about it as you can. So you really still have those practices there of artists that will bring their own work to an auction house and sit in the front row and see and participate how their work is being bid up. And it has something refreshing to me as well.
Back to the news. 2 weeks ago, at the occasion of Art Basel in Hong Kong, the Financial Times published this special. It's called, of course, Collecting. But I think that the first essay, they had one on the front page, was kind of interesting. It's called Beyond the Samosas. And this essay was interviewing witnesses, artists, curators, and these people, Aaron Cesar here from Delfina, were saying, let's stop this whole regional thing, because what the new thing should be is that we are going to connect Latin American artists with Indian artists, Chinese artists with artists from Angola. Is that a gimmick, or is that something which you, as a historian, can you live with that?
I feel it's a particular agenda and perspective. Just see local artists in a kind of international framework. That's typically like a Guggenheim. They're doing that. They select a particular kind of local artists from different places. If you ask them, they have a reason. They say we are looking for that particular kind of artists. They are international. They are transnational. So they are very clear. I feel it's a particular agenda. It doesn't represent that place. Represent a particular kind of networking ambition from individual artist points.
How do we feel about that, Elvira? Is that something you would like to propose to Tate Modern? Say, we want now to go beyond the cliché of the national identity?
Samosas. I think samosas are delicious. But anyhow, I think one of the things that I will add to that is that what we're trying to do, at least at Tate and with the strategy in Africa, is to also rely on local expertise. The way that you avoid the given list of the 100 most important artists in Africa now is to work with local expertise, to work with local artists that are the ones that are defining their context, that are the ones that are in contact with the society, with the communities that surround them, but also that are the ones that are creating these conversations, global, south to south, defining a global arena in that sense that somehow escape the West. And I think that's the only way to escape cynicism. And I think this is also something very important, is that what are we going to tell as a story about these regions within the international context that Tate Collection, for instance, in this case, operates. But also, I think one of the things that you were saying, Olav, is also important, is what are these local stories telling? And I think that there is going to be a moment where we are going to see a conversation happening locally that is not necessarily the one that we're going to have here. And we're going to have a conversation here in which we include certain figures that will help us to tell a story Tate way. That is not necessarily the story that other countries, regions, collectors are going to tell. And I think that is also crucial. So there is a moment in which the popular and the significant are going to be clashing. And I think this is a very interesting moment. And the fact that we won't have ways in which to reconcile those stories, to agree on those stories, for me is the most beautiful aspect of this job. As a curator, I feel like very engaged with the possibility of embracing the uncertainty. Yes?
I have a question, just why I say Guggenheim. That's actually very understandable for the New York audience. You present these kind of artists, everybody can immediately understand. Mm-hmm. But as you say, we want to represent the local story and the local memory in a city like London or New York or a different place. Like in my remark, I say somehow insert them into a different system and different kinds of cultural history. Can we actually do that? Or we have to do some kind of very complex translation. And in the process of translation, we turn them into someone else. There's a possibility.
Well, I mean, there is obviously, and I agree with you, there will be something that will transform that. But what is interesting to hear now is that, as Kaderatia will say, this is not only creating a history or creating a new history, but repairing. So reparation is a thing here. I mean, it's not that we are going to be corrective, but we're going to tell a story that was actually happening. You know, like people like Ibrahim Salahi was already in touch with people in the Mbari Mbayo Club in Ibadan in the 60s, and they had conversation with the Spiral Group in New York at the time. We haven't told that story yet. We are going to tell that story through including his work in the collection. So it's not about inventing a new story. It's that putting in the platform things that were neglected or overlooked.
Olav, you're writing in our Red Book about contemporary art and its commercial markets. You're saying, in other words, the super wealthy collectors, they behave more as taste followers than as taste makers. The economic power of these collectors may be enormous. Their cultural power is very limited. Is this helping us to not, I mean, regulate?
It's definitely not helping you.
to regulate a little bit these new markets that we say, okay, let's not make the same mistakes as in the past. How can we increase our cultural power over these artifacts, these new works of art? Should we do something extra? Should we do something which is firmly saying, you know, we want first to culturally establish these things? Maybe we need new institutions which are not about curating, but about remediating, because, you know, remediating means correcting and improving. Would it make sense to reinvent institutions in order to protect and to create more of a kind of cultural power?
But wait, let me just, I mean, you presented a bit out of context. Let me first maybe say a little bit.
I'm not a journalist.
What I mean with that phrase there, I think there is at the moment in the art world this discourse, and you can like put names with it. Isabella Graf in Germany very strongly, who talk about this in a global art world, about this dealer-collector figure. So what she's basically arguing, and I think a lot of people in the art world agree with her, is that in this new global art world / art market, the people who determine the canon of contemporary art are more and more the art dealers, super powerful art dealers, and they're super rich collectors. They're billionaires, whether they are from Russia, based in London or in China or in Sao Paulo, or just in the old centers like London and New York, they would be determining the canon. And I don't agree with that. I think that collectors, and especially collectors in these newly rich economies, these new billionaires, that they are in a tremendous need of legitimation. They are in a tremendous need of hearing from all kinds of institutions, including the Tate, that it's really good what they are doing. And they are looking very closely at what is going on in the old world institutions, in at the Museum of Modern Art, in the Tate, in the Centre Pompidou, etc. So they are not making Tates; they are following what the institutions are doing. That's just the context.
Okay, that's number one. But number two is the question to the three of you.
Sorry.
In order to do things differently with these new works of art, artifacts, do we need to reinvent our institutions? Do we need institutions which are not as much about curating, which is selecting, embodying with meaning, but maybe remediating, which is improving, taking care, correcting? A kind of new type of institution. Not an anthropological museum, not an ethnological museum, not a Tate Modern, not a Guggenheim. Something new, maybe.
Why is everybody looking at me? Nobody knows you're looking at me. Well, I mean, partially things are being reinvented. I mean, the Tate is reinventing itself partially with its acquisition committees, and it's not maybe...
I'm just a moderator, I don't...
Yeah. So I think there is quite... I mean, it's not like the present institutions are non-responsive to what is going on in this limited global art world. Would it need like entirely new institutions built from scratch? Well, I don't think it makes much sense to talk about it in such a way, as if you can design them like on a drawing table. Oh, we are in this world now, so we should have that type of institution there. And no, that's not what is happening. But I do think that all the present institutions, the way the biennials work, the way in the market the fairs work, that they are reinventing themselves permanently. I think everybody realizes right now that in the dynamism of the present art world, you cannot stand still.
Oh,
you raised two questions. The first one, I think your remark and your writing is very interesting, because as a historian, I see that your statement really challenges the old notion of patronage, because in our history, since 1980s, there is a brand of our history places very heavy emphasis on the role of patrons, basically like a Medici, like those kind of powerful patrons. They define the taste. They choose the best artists. Then they were followed by other less nobles, whatever. So what you are suggesting, maybe that's a new condition. Right now, the museums and other institutions, even art fair or whatever, who choose those works, the selectors, initial people who screens the artists and works. So maybe that's just a comment. I feel in the current condition, maybe what is the real patron, even the notion of patron, who patronizes art, and what's the role of money in this thing. That's becoming really interesting. The second one about museum actually is related, not exactly your question. I'm thinking about, when we think about museum, we immediately think about like a British Museum or Metropolitan Museum, MoMA, these kind of, we call the super or encyclopedia museums. But I feel we have to put in a historical perspective, because this kind of museum resulted of particular historical condition, basically colonial, imperialism. And today, no other countries can do that anymore. No other country can go to Africa to collect all this work, go to China to take away all these statues from. So that is what to do with other countries now. How can you have museums even? If a country, China, has a lot of money, but you cannot just buy a museum like that.
So how are you doing that?
Yeah, exactly. So so that's really, if you count this kind of encyclopedia museum, can represent different cultures, less than 10 in the world. Some are smaller. The big ones, you really can cover every period, every country. That's totally a notion of imperialism. Then now what's happening? What can China do? Actually, I've been talking to them. I'm talking to India or some other. Maybe there are different notions of museum. Just a collection is not really important because collection means possession. You just possess things through markets, through powers, through army, to bring things back, often break them away from their contacts.
Exclusion.
Yeah, some things were created portably, that's fine. Something actually belong to the place. You have to physically take them away. So I feel that's really terrible, unhealthy. Of course, under the name of beauty, we still enjoy them. But today I feel maybe that sort of museum is not really our dream. Our purpose is not to add more collections, especially from other places, but rather something movable, like things can move, or people can move. You don't have to see everything here. You go there, You want to see Africa, you go to Africa. It's not in New York. You sit there, you can see everything.
So you're right.
Sort of my notion of museum should change, should be challenged, should be criticized, sometimes condemned. Anyway, so I feel then we can have a new version of an exhibition, museum, artifacts, and people.
So the Louvre in Abu Dhabi and the Guggenheim Abu Dhabi is your ideal museum then?
No, actually, I'm sort of on the committee with Guggenheim. I have a difficulty to see a big, this looming, beautiful, like a mirage in the desert, and Guggenheim is selecting artifacts for the museum. I don't know. I feel that's not the vision I'm talking about.
What is your ideal place?
Well, my idea is that museums have always been about the truth, about certainty, and I wonder what will happen if museums start to embrace uncertainty, if museums start to display question instead of presenting the history as it is, if we embrace the moment that we are living as something that is transitional, ephemeral, that refers to that. And maybe in that sense, collecting is less important and it's more important the program and how the program brings these other contexts. When you think about the notion of the museum, linked particularly with colonialism, was one of the, not together with the census and the map, which one was one of the things that helped to shape and confine the colonized countries. If we think that in reverse, if we think about how we want to engage in a conversation, in a larger conversation with people and cultures from other regions, maybe what we need to do is something that is, as you were saying, mobile, more ephemeral, more flexible, more organic, that allows to that. I think in a way we are doing that with all the programs that we do at Tate in relation to the exhibitions that we bring, but also what our colleagues are doing in learning, what we are doing through projects like Urban Generation or others that connect the schools, because I think learning process is also very, very, very important for this cause. So uncertainty and the way that uncertainty reflects on things that are immediate, that I think is the way.
Olav,
forward.
you are a sociologist, and I know sociology is the art of asking the right questions in order maybe to find a perfect answer. I'm going to ask you a question, maybe not perfect, but how can we, for God's sake, organize a museum of uncertainty? How do you do that?
Sorry.
My God.
You want to think about it?
Yes.
Okay. Give us an answer in half an hour. The floor is open to you. Questions for Elvira Dyangani Ose, Olav Velthuis, and Hung. And don't forget, Olav, you have a half hour to think about my question.
Plenty.
Who has a question? We need a microphone. You want to give a remark, that's also possible. There's a remark here on the second row. Please tell us your name.
My name is Young-Suk Park. I'm Korean art historian, formerly taught at SOAS. And Hung is very good friend and colleague. So I'm very happy to be here. Since I have been teaching art history, I am educated in Heidelberg in Western art history and East Asian art history. I found Europe has a great tradition. However, in many cases, I found Europeans are fairly Eurocentric. No matter how long I'm living here, but I still find in every aspect. For instance, Elvira already mentioned that in the early period in France, they showed African art in ethnographic museum, while Egyptian art in Louvre. For instance, that is their concept of ancient culture. Except China, Europeans have very little knowledge, except China and Japan, I must say, very little knowledge on Korea as well. Just coming back to your comment on localization versus globalization, and here local galleries and European galleries show mostly contemporary local artists. It is not the case in Korea, for instance. We have Samsung company built famous modern contemporary art museum, which was built, and the most famous contemporary European architects were invited to build this museum. For instance, Renzo Piano and Frank Gehry, they are all participated in this new building. And I was very pleased to find in the museum Joseph Beuys, for instance, great German artist, as well as Damien Hirst are also represented there.
So what
My question is, in many other parts of the world, except India probably, China and other parts of the world, they are more interested in globalization in art and culture.
Than in Europe?
Than in Europe.
Okay.
Yeah.
Olaf.
I mean, the example that you mentioned, there are many of them. By the way, it's interesting that it's always a small group of architects, Gehry, Jean Nouvel, Renzo Piano, that are building these global museums all over the world. But anyway, I really don't agree with that it is something that something about Europe or the United States. It is in China as well. If you talk to European or American, I'm sorry that I'm making references to the market all the time. It's a bit my specialization. But if you talk to European and American art galleries who are active in the Chinese market, and they tell about the difficulties they have to represent and promote the work of European and American artists there, it's they have to have a very, very long breath. It is not something that is going overnight. In Brazil, one of the, not the last, but the art fair of last year, which was a great art fair, there were, I think, about 5 galleries from outside of Latin America. There were hardly any artists being presented from other regions than Latin America. It was an extremely local affair, extremely dynamic, extremely interesting. I mean, these are not judgments about qualities, but this local orientation of art worlds, I honestly find everywhere, and there are many examples everywhere, exceptions everywhere, just like the one you mentioned, but it is not the norm as I encounter it in my research.
Another question.
I was just wondering how global the panel thinks what we're talking about is, if you think about the countries that keep getting mentioned, and I thought about this not too long ago, Brazil, India, China, Azerbaijan, Angola, Nigeria, it seems a bit diverse, but the commonality is that these are all countries that in the last few years, they've had GDP growth of over 7% and have an incredible dysfunction in the spread of wealth. So it's about the commerce driving globalization. I was just wondering what your views are on this.
Olav.
Well, yeah, it is one of the drivers. I think why there is a moment of globalization right now is, of course, partially because of economic globalization and because of wealth in these countries. Usually it is wealth that is spread very unevenly. So a small class of very rich people, but it's definitely not the only driver. I mean, there are many other drivers. Of course, it also has to do with migration more generally, and museums getting interested because they want to be in dialogue with the society that they are in, and it's a multicultural society. Another driver is the art world itself. I mean, what has been briefly mentioned, this search for new geo-aesthetic frontiers. A curator can make a reputation by kind of, well, yeah, that's the way it is, by, at least that's the way it used to be, by finding this new region that nobody didn't think of yet. And hey, we find some very interesting, and this is not meant cynically, we find some very interesting art being produced there as well. So, well, let's try to introduce it in this or that biennial, and then it filters into the system. So that it has many different drivers, and I think the reason why the current moment of globalization is relatively strong, if limited. The reason why it is also strong is that you have a couple of those motors, engines, working at the same time in the last, I would say, 2 decades, since the late 80s. It also, of course, has to do, like in China and in Russia, with just political reasons, with the collapse of...
I follow your last sentence. I feel economy, of course, very important, but there are 2 other factors I want to emphasize. One is technology. Another is politics, political condition. Just now thinking about internet, computer as a tastemakers. So anywhere you can see almost same thing if you want. And also talking about different countries, you are totally right. Each country has a different condition, but somehow you say after 1990 or the 1890s, the movement of the people, the artists, they travel, including the Biennale or something. This kind of movement also based on local political condition. Like China before 1980s, people couldn't move. Like I couldn't go out. I went to America in 1980. Most artists, thousands, moved to different parts, including London, in early 1990s. So that is a globalization on this kind of individual level. They moved around, and now they go back to China. You know, most of them go back to China. So that's very interesting. So we see this tide.
And I wanted to follow up in your last comment to say also that another thing that drives that kind of phenomena is the diaspora, the role of the diaspora, and also the role that diaspora plays in creating ownership. Because all these comments on local culture is about owning, the narrative, being the agent of your own narrative, being the narrator of your story.
And now we have, after the diaspora, we have even a new phenomenon, which Achille Mbembe is describing also, which is, of course, China taking over Africa, right?
Indeed. Yes. Yeah.
News to me.
Well, go to Bamako, go to Ouagadougou. Elvira, I mean, you are traveling a lot in Africa, and what you see are not the Belgians anymore, or the British or the Germans, but Chinese. So I wonder when the first Chinese museum will be in Bamako.
Yeah. But I think in terms of that, I think the conversation between China and I think it's happening in 2 different routes, at least what I can tell in my experience in Lubumbashi. You have that conversation in the political realm, so it's authorities talking to authorities, corporations talking to authorities, and the other way around. And also people imagine a different world, like there is a sort of a different demographic. In 15 years or 20 years, we will have these new kids, what Michael McGarry, the South African artist, called in one of his series the chocolate cities, which are a neighborhood sort of informed by immigrants from Africa living in Chinese urban areas. No? So I think that conversation is happening that way. I don't see much happening in the cultural realm. What we are seeing is the witness, like how photographers, artists are reflecting on that kind of conversation. But I haven't seen yet that museum or like a very much integral conversation between these two communities.
Question. First, gentleman over there, and then you.
Yes, you are.
Yeah, sorry.
Just to pick up on your point there, is that I'm South African, but I live in London, and I'm very aware that the art world in Africa is quite fragmented. And I have also been, I have South American friends, and where the South American art world generally, that's Brazil, the whole of South America, is not fragmented. And it seems to me that there's, if we're talking about the role of places like the Tate or big museums and biennales, it's both to mirror the local culture, but also to act as a repository from which people can act. So it's both something that is deep and also generative. And really just to think about how that might be achieved in Africa.
Well, I think you're totally right. On the one hand, because collecting hasn't been, at least privately and in terms of public institution, hasn't been that prolific in the continent. First of all, I think the case in the case of Latin America, there have been all those conversations happening, and in the case of and that also has to do with the language. Most of the Latin American countries speak in Spanish. What happened in Africa is that you have the Francophone areas talking to each other, the English-speaking countries talking to each other, the Lusophone countries talking to each other. In that kind of regional configuration, they respond to that also in terms of the culture that they present. And as I say, because they were not strong or as strong as they are now, collection or collecting activities, the festival had a crucial role. If you think about 66 when Negritude is set up and the cultural policies of Senghor became the leitmotif of a city, but also a way of understanding culture throughout decades until the new government replaced those policies in the 80s. If you think about how, for instance, the importance of the discourse of negritude, but also Africanness in the context of Algiers, also reunites everyone's internal idea that Pan-Africanism could only be what was happening in Dakar, because it was more about blackness, and that excludes the North Africa. Or if you think about Festac, and I think about Festac 77, which for me is the most important of these different festivals throughout the continent at that period, because in the Festac they were asking the question about the black and the African world together. And they were looking at not only to what was happening within the region, but what happened around the world with black communities that were as far as, in Russia. All those communities. There is an incredible book called Lagos Program, which look at 20 years' time from the 77 to see how culture and education will embrace those aspects. The problem was that the programs, the economic programs and the World Bank in the 80s killed those ideas. And people start to be worried only about what was happening in their own communities, in their countries, cultural policies, and the Pan-African conversation never took place. So that is why, for instance, like in a place like South Africa, you have this cohesive, vibrant art scene, and in places like Dakar, it seems that there is a momentum sort of like months before the Biennale and right after, but then, for almost a year and a half, things sort of like get fade away, although there are people responding to that, and in Bamako the same. I mean, what is interesting is that there is a very rich and vibrant art scene in all these places, and what we are trying to do, for instance, is not to, I don't think it's the role of a museum like Tate to create, to be the repository of that knowledge. We had to help them, if that is what they want, to produce these things there locally. One of the things that I encountered when I was in Ghana recently and invited several people from different areas is that they are having several conversations that are almost the same. That they are talking about what's happening in the public sphere, they are talking about how the artists engage with society in the local context. And that conversation is happening in Johannesburg, Addis Ababa, Bamako, Luanda. Why don't these things, connect more? Why don't connect in a different way? So this is something that we can provide, have a conversation between different protagonists for that to happen. But in general, these things are happening. There are local experts that are taking care of that. So it's not our role to do it. It's our role to be in the conversation, I think.
She's good, no? Third row, your question.
Thank you. My name is Lang. My question is to Elvira, because just now our conversation didn't use the word power directly, but everything we talk about is about power. So if we want to think about the power in the art industry, do you believe that we're still on the continent we call the post-colonial, coined by Mbembe? By Mbembe? The Mbembe? Ashina Mbembe, post-colonial. Do you believe that there are only Western artists versus the non-Western artists? Giving the example, in the Venice Biennale this time, there are, other than the Chinese pavilion, there are more than 300 Chinese artists went there. Why is this phenomenon? And usually in recent years, a lot of Chinese artists come to New York or London to hold their exhibitions, not necessarily to be invited by those top-level institutions, but they pay the venue themselves, and then they can write this exhibition on their CV, and when they go back, they can show off, okay, I hold exhibition in certain Western place. Yeah. So what do you think? Is it because they are non-Western identity, or are we still the post-colonial something? Yeah, thank you.
I mean, I think in a way I agree with you. There is a very much, it's a question of powers. I agree with you totally. What we need, I mean, for example, I think about the Angolan pavilion that now won the Golden Lion. Is this going to change the art in Angola? Is this going to change the way in which we perceive the art from not only Angola but other places in Africa or other areas in the world? This is the question. What is that about? It's about sort of like acknowledging or recognizing that kind of change. I think what is important is that, and this is what I learned from my research in Africa, is that people is trying to create new role models. And maybe the museum that they are embracing is not the museum that we know. They are doing platform, art centers, companies, things that somehow are more organic and help to create an easier conversation, a more nuanced conversation with things that are happening locally. That doesn't mean that it's not connecting with the rest of the world. It connects with the rest of the world their own way. What we need to think is, what is the definition of success? Is success to be displayed at the Tate Modern? Or is success to be, resourceful and provide different ideas and different elements locally? Is successful somebody that goes to Bamako and then go, to the Bamako Encounter and then became, display in New York? Or is successful somebody that maybe had used that success in order to create a biennale for the artists locally to display their work and be presented, beyond the framework of the local?
Maybe interesting to ask our sociologist also, how can you, are there new ways of measuring success, which is equally important for alternative institutions, by the way?
Yeah, this would be typical, I would remark to a student, that's an empirical question, that is easy to find out, and that's partially what we do. You can just ask artists, what are your aims? I mean, what would be your biggest dream? What are you achieving for? And what we hear a lot in our interviews is still that they want this solo show in an institution in Europe or the United States.
But
that's
don't you think that this is a construction, like the Taste? Like being at the Tate Modern, having a large show at the Tate Modern?
Of course it's a construction. Of course it's a construction.
So that's what I think is,
it's a construction,
we need
absolutely.
These new
but
roles.
It's a real answer.
Yeah,
I mean, it's a real dream.
Yeah, the question you just mentioned, the Venice Biennale, that's amazing to me. This kind of army of Chinese artists. And I wonder, actually, someone interviewed me. I don't have an answer. But just talking about power still, where is the power located there? I still return to your answer. The power still is held by the curators, the gatekeepers. And these people, 300, try to break the gate, but they are still outside, most of them. Yeah. So I feel their main audience is in China. they go to Venice, they can tell the people in China, oh, I was here, you know, I'm among. But for the most international curators in Venice, they are still remain outsiders. So you're a gatekeeper, and I feel it's an interesting phenomenon.
Mm-hmm. Judith Nesbitt.
We hear a lot about the hundreds of museums that are being built in China. And there's a very commonplace observation that they're just buildings and there isn't the software, the people, the expertise, the art to fill them. But I would be very interested to hear Wu Hong's response to that. What impact do you think these museums will have over the longer term? And if you were emperor and in charge of all of these hundreds of museums, what would be your dream for these museums?
He said he doesn't want to.
Definitely not emperor. But it's a good question. It's really, I see it's a good thing. You know, it's a transition from like China was dominated by politics, then dominated by money in the market. Now the culture become catchword, so culture. So, but right now these museums are still hardware. They are not software yet. They have these buildings, very one big than the other, but they don't have people. They don't have a good show. They don't have curators, even handlers. So I feel in time there will emerge a public culture. People go to museum, maybe new kind of museum. So I go there. I don't want to talk about just use MoMA or use Metropolitan as a model. Those are experience. Those you can use, including Tate. The important thing, I feel, they have a lot of younger directors, younger curators, so they can talk to people here. What would be the next generation, next future, not based on the past, based on what's going on here, including our discussion. So I feel it takes a lot to realize that, including what kind of museum, private museum, and government museum, public museum. The definition is very, at the moment, very confusing. But I feel it's a process. Thank you.
You had a question.
He's a curator himself.
But I don't have any comments on the Chinese Artist Army in Venice. But following your discussion on the museum, Wu Laoshi, I would like you to extend a little bit about the re-examination on the notion of museum, particularly when you say that some artifacts or artworks can go back to the original context, which will make a lot of sense. And it sounds so encouraging that some artifacts in the super museum can find their way home. But I think, on the other hand, but within the museum, that the collections, some artifacts or artworks, they're produced for exhibiting, but some are out of the context. So would you like to discuss a little bit more about this, please?
You mean produce in China? Or?
No. I mean, not necessarily in China overall,
yes.
Because some artifacts are produced for exhibitions.
Oh, exactly.
And
when
some
this idea of arts emerged, so that arts were produced for exhibition, collection.
Yeah.
I feel in that case, but still there's sense of context. Like here, the third question is the art can become a kind of way to connect people, to make people in different places to understand each other. I feel that's a part of my idea, art should travel. So including all sorts of art should travel. Like the thing, the art created for exhibition or art not created for exhibition, but forced separation from. I feel right now just how to travel, the questions. So I talked to some big, this kind of Chinese museum. I say, you have money. You can use the money to buy things. You can also use money to fund the high quality temporary exhibitions. For example, you buy one little painting. You can probably organize 10 good exhibitions from anywhere around the world. Then the people in the city, you have this stream of exhibition from anywhere. That's much more important than so-called permanent collection. I just feel, just from receiver's end, what a museum can do to the community, to a city, even city like Beijing, Shanghai. If there's you say, hundreds of museums, I think it's thousands of exhibitions would be better. Just because exhibitions represent ideas, curatorial ideas, not just objects. Because each exhibition, there's agenda, there's a new plan, there's a new aspect. I feel that's sort of my thing.
Question. And then you, in the middle, 7th row.
Hi. Thank you for tonight. I was just wondering, we haven't talked about the authority of art schools that are, for most of them, in Western Europe or America, and also about how local the artist is when he went to study in such a school, for instance, Shinobari, and then comes back to his country and gets an international reputation. Anybody?
Well, I think in the case of African countries, there was a very interesting initiative in the 20s in Lagos, Nigeria, led by Aina Onabolu, who thought that he wanted to have art school as part of an art education as part of the curriculum of middle school. So that's to put you an example of somebody that within his own self-taught practice decided to learn art, and the art will be something that any human being should have. After that, in the 30s, 40s, 50s, there have been a number of art schools in Africa that were sometimes led by colonial administrators, colonial teachers, etc., that somehow also lead to different understanding of the art. Sometimes where artists were following specific curriculum that was exactly like the one that you will be taught in Paris or London, but in other cases, like in Lagos with Bennett Murray, for instance, that will change and will ask the artist to look at the inner self to transform that. And there are many cases of modern art school in Egypt, in Sudan, in South Africa, in many places where the artists and the local authorities and local artists create a new understanding of modernity, their own understanding of modernity through that, in which many cases has the Western world as the way forward. But in other cases was linked, in the case of Sudan, for instance, with Quranic art school, Quranic school, no art, and a different understanding of how the visual vocabulary of those different places happen. What happened in most cases is in the 30s and 40s, depending on which area you are looking at. For instance, if you think about somebody like Ernst Mancoba, that had to travel to Paris in order to produce his work because he was limited by the South Africa understanding of the apartheid and the South African understanding of what a black man could do at the time. He had to go to Paris. He traveled also to London and connect with the Cobra Group, for instance. People like Gerard Sekoto happened to that the same. But somebody like Ibrahim Al-Salahi, for instance, was educated in the arts in the context of Sudan before he traveled to do master's studies here. So again, of course, there is a Western colonial power behind the idea of art education, but there were also examples before that were linked to arts education as well. And we had to also take into account the traditional understanding of the art. If you think about somebody like Bene Bumbu, the way that he conceived art is an Igbo understanding of the art. So he's an Igbo man and wants to reproduce his work as it was conceived, as connected with nature, as connected with a specific cosmology. So arts in that case also refers to, or arts education in that case also refers to a local system. And artists in the 50s somehow challenged the curricula For instance, the Sharia rebels in the late 50s in Nigeria, they challenged the British curricula in order to achieve a different aesthetic that connects both the post-colonial subjectivity and the tradition. Just to put you some examples of things that were happening in education.
First over there. And then you.
Hi, Hello. Hi, on the note of Law going global, and I would like to make a short remark about Hong Kong. I think Hong Kong is a bit of an extreme example. If you look at how Art Basel took over Art HK, and then it just came to Hong Kong. So it's like part of a globalization, and this kind of globalization is not only on the cultural level, but then also on the capital. Like, for example, with USB, now it's going to sponsor Art Basel HK next year. So Deutsche Bank is being kicked out. So this is also a kind of like globalization. And then during the art fair, the international galleries, Western galleries in particular, they did really well in terms of the sales. But then for the Asia Pacific galleries, like from what I know, is that they had to struggle for the first few days, and it took a.
So what is your question?
Well, my question is, and the other Asian cities, they are all very curious of Hong Kong's situation, and they aspire to be Hong Kong, like for example Singapore. So I'm just wondering if Hong Kong is actually this window of or a gate to globalization for Asia as a whole. Thank you.
Or Hong or Olav, maybe?
I can say a few words then, because we were talking about it, Hong Kong. I feel just again return to my earlier suggestion. I don't see Hong Kong is really either local or global. Actually, it's established the current situation really is supported by these transnational museum galleries and the art fair. Somehow they have this idea. It's a global mapping, but Hong Kong is just exactly because it's both. It's hybrid. It's both English, their language, and Chinese. They're very close to all these Asia and the Chinese cities. So it can become like a very ideal connector. So I feel it's really maybe represent, as you suggest, it's a kind of new networking. So these very powerful institutions try to find those space, which is both global and local. Then you can form some kind of pattern.
And a new word, hybrid. Olav.
Well, yeah, what is interesting about Hong Kong is that it's one of the few new art capitals that is not completely, but quite disconnected from a community of artists. Of course, there is a community of artists, a very vibrant one, but not as vibrant and not as big as it would be in, say, Beijing, or especially in Beijing or in other Chinese cities. The reason why it became, in a very quick time, like only over a couple of years, why it became such a strong center in Asia, partially had to do with very mundane reasons that for, especially for the galleries and also for the fair, it's much easier to organize things there because there's much less red tape. You don't have the taxes that you would have on mainland China. So there are very mundane reasons why Hong Kong got there, which also means, by the way, that it could be kind of a fragile situation. Coming back to those European galleries that did very well there, yes, they did indeed very well, but not necessarily selling to local clients there. They also sold a lot to like Europeans and American collectors that were flying into Hong Kong as a part of this whole welfare biennial circuit that has emerged.
Last question. Very last question, because Olav still has to respond to one.
That will only take 5 seconds, so you can easily put another.
I was just wondering how globalization will impact, or what are your views on globalization in relation to art history, and how those new art coming from China, those new emerging places, could be incorporated in this discourse, which is fundamentally European or Europe-centric, I guess. So I was wondering your thoughts on this issue concerning,
No, it's for you.
It's for you. Can you speak a little bit louder? Just to repeat the question.
How do you think how will it be possible, or how art history as a European mainly discourse from its origin?
So we return to art history. That's a great topic.
Exactly.
Right, exactly.
Will be able to embrace or to incorporate.
Right. So you must know the recent years has been a trend to try to write called the global art history. It's not just a European, but then all different cultures. There's some efforts, my colleagues, including myself, but it's very difficult because the result can be very boring, just like different chapters cover, just like you put 10 books together as one book, but there's no actual connections. So I feel people are still trying very hard. There's different ways. So for example, talking about the interactions, it's not chronology, but find the interactions, like colonialism, even before, like a Silk Road, like people travel, object travel, use those as a kind of narrative thread. So that's one possibility. The other kinds is evidence. So every culture went through, for example, from these crafts to art stage. Like they created ritual art, religious art, and gradually the birth of the artist. Every culture went through that. So we can talk about the evidence. When we study ancient art, it's not just ancient Greece, Rome, but it's about archaeology. We all use archaeology as our evidence. When we pass a certain period, we begin to talk about artists, biography, painting, portable, easel painting, scroll painting. So I feel those parallels can provide a very strong methodological tools. So I feel that's sort of, I've been talking to my colleagues.
Interesting. Olav, can we organize a new type of museum, a museum of uncertainty?
On a very general level, I think museums are by definition in the business of uncertainty. I mean, because the contemporary art is about uncertainty. What a contemporary art museum is doing, not knowing how an audience will respond to the way it puts together its exhibitions, but also much more fundamentally not being certain itself about artistic worth and what will remain worthy in the long run. It is already about uncertainty, and I think there are also limits to that, to the amount of uncertainty an audience can bear. So please don't make it more uncertain than it is already.
So will Chinese contemporary art, will it stay forever, or?
Contemporaneity stays forever. Contemporary art comes and goes. Actually, the term itself was meaningful in the 90s. Because contemporary art as a term carry a lot of meaning in China, political, alternative, but right now just a word. Like here is contemporary art. What that means just means something we don't know.
Elvira,
yes.
Contemporary African art.
Yes.
To be taken seriously?
Sorry, I loosened the mic.
To be taken seriously?
It is taken seriously. Just won the Venice Golden Lion.
We almost forget.
More said than that.
Ladies and gentlemen, global citizenship and culture. Angola won the Golden Lion for the best national pavilion. I think we learned a lot today. One of the most important things is that talking about global citizenship is not, we cannot afford just to talk about economics, about religion, about power. Because so many things are coming together finally in this thing called art, artifact, work of art. We don't even know anymore how to name it. And maybe the naming of this thing is becoming another form of interesting certainty. What we do know, what is a certainty, however, is that we have to stop being cynical. We have to stop being cynical about, for instance, the Chinese auction houses. Are these incredible prices some collectors want to pay for Iranian art bought in Dubai? Stop being cynical. Maybe local memory is as important as local taste. do we really still know what's going on in the 40s, in the 50s, and the 60s? And maybe we have to give up this linear concept of time, because things are coming back in cycles, especially when we start talking about global art. And maybe we have even to invent a new type of museum. Uncertain, mobile, stop possessing, we don't know yet. And even a new form of art history. I would like to conclude with the following words. Global citizenship is not the same as global art. And global art is not the same as global citizenship. But citizenship, our civitas, our civic society, spread over the world. And we have to work on that society is getting even more civic, cannot do without art, because art is just as important as religion, as political power, and definitely as economical power. Thank you so much, Hung. Thank you, Elvira Dyangani Ose. Thank you, Olav Velthuis. And I still have 1 minute to go. And thank you so much, all the partners, all the project partners. I would like to thank Accenture, Africa Progress Panel, Barclays, SOAS, Samin, and especially our director of Samin, Michael Aminian. Michael, thank you so much. Thank you, Marco Daniel. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.